From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I have an interesting milestone to share with you, Jason.
Oh, I haven't heard this yet.
No, you haven't. No. I was saving it.
Yeah.
Because our listeners, our hardcore listeners may recall you and I discussing the Rewatcher podcast that we were both listening to at some point.
Oh, I thought this was going to be the e-bike.
No. No.
Okay, for those listening, Joelle still hasn't ridden her e-bike to work.
I'm afraid to ride on the road. I don't want to get run over.
Okay, so it's not going to happen at all now? You're just calling it off?
Well, maybe if we move to that new office, then there's kind of bike path access and I don't need to ride on regular roads.
Okay. Hang in there.
Hang in there, listeners. It could still happen.
Okay, Rewatcher.
So today, the episode that is coming out this evening is the series finale episode.
That was such a good finale.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So, yes, I've been doing I watch it on the weekend and then listen to the episode during the week.
Yeah.
So I watched the final on the weekend.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it goes in order, probably Buffy, how they finished that up, and then Breaking Bad was an awesome, really well tied up
I don't know.
Finale.
I got to the bathtub scene in Breaking Bad and noped out after that.
Okay, yeah. No, I think, it goes Game of Thrones at 0. How they wrapped up that series. Yes, then you've got, Breaking Bad and Buffy right at the top. Yeah. But no, that is a great milestone.
It is.
Are you staying up and listening to it today?
Well,
when does it come out?
It airs at like 5 p.m, so there's no staying up. I just listen to it while I'm cooking dinner.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're looking forward to that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then they're going to do, they've decided on the next show that they're doing as well, and it is, I can't think of the name of it, that other vampire show that's set in sort of the southern US.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I don't know if I'll listen to that because, I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, now it's going to plague us. What is the name of that show?
Yeah, I can hear its theme song.
Yeah,
but I just can't think of the name of it.
It was one word. Two. True Blood.
That's it.
Got
yes.
It.
Yeah.
All right, listeners, you don't have to worry about Googling what that show was.
That's I don't know if anybody would have had a lot of success. I guess Vampire Southern US, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a good series too. Anywho.
It was. These hosts kind of get squirmy and awkward whenever there's a sex scene in the show that they're watching. So I don't know how they'll go watching True Blood because there's a lot of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But look, this is not a vampire TV.
Look, we could do a spin-off podcast.
Yeah, I know. Email Dan at flourishdx.com if you want us to do a spin-off podcast.
Vampire TV shows, yeah.
Yeah, okay. But look,
more specifically, podcasts that we're listening to about vampire TV shows.
That we have watched
that we're
previously.
Recording a podcast about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very niche. Niche is our jam, Jason.
Feel like niche. Do what no one else is doing. All right. Our guest is waiting. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. This person is a workplace mental health and psychosocial risk specialist. We like having those on the show.
We sure do.
Who helps organisations create safer, healthier ways of working. His PhD advances psychosocial risk management, implementation science, and realist evaluation. He is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Menzies Institute for Medical Research. Welcome to the podcast, Adam Nebbs.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Now, Adam, we've never actually had you on the podcast. We did do a webinar. I feel it was during that COVID blip of time with you and Ange Martin together, but I don't think you've ever been on the podcast. So welcome for the first time. It's been long overdue.
Mm.
Thank you. Yeah. I've never gone back and rewatched that webinar because I was a baby researcher. I had no understanding. I just dread to listen back to all the things I got wrong. But, thanks for having faith in me back then to get me on, So.
And I do remember that one because it was the first time we had real significant audio issues where we were recording through the laptop rather than these beautiful Rode microphones. That was,
Okay.
not great.
Oh, that's when it switched to the laptop mic instead of these. Yeah, that was terrible. Yeah.
Yeah, and we couldn't re-record it, unfortunately.
No, and it was live too. Yeah. Dreadful.
Oh, well.
That on our end, Adam, not on your end.
Yeah. No, the content was great.
Just our terrible audio.
Yeah.
Adam, what podcast do you like to listen to?
Yeah, it's a good question. The one I listened to most recently that I really loved is a limited series that finished back in 2021. It's called the Long Time Academy, and it features a lady by the name of Alice Saltmarsh, who interviews people all over the world about thinking long time, as she calls it. So essentially, it's looking at the economy, politics, pop culture, work, and just how a lot of the decisions that we make are very, based on short-term thinking, and just encouraging us to get better at, thinking about, the future and future generations. And so she'll get all kinds of interesting guests on there. So that was very interesting, and I think very relevant to psychosocial risk too. Gave me a lot of thoughts around how a lot of the interventions and programs we have are very short term, and how we could kind of, start to think a bit more long term in that space. Otherwise, I'm a big fan of history. So I love the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan. And so that, as you'd expect, covers the founding of Rome through to its destruction. So that's very, lots of episodes for that one. And the other one is very niche, but I think that's on point because this seems like we've discussed some niche things today already. I'm listening to a podcast about a TV show called Masters of the Air. So for anyone who's a fan of Band of Brothers or The Pacific, this is kind of the third show in that wheelhouse. And that kind of follows the 100th bomb group. And this podcast is essentially, interviews Tom Hanks and producers from the show as they talk about that show as well. So nothing really related to psych health and safety anymore. I think I've burned my brain listening to that stuff, over the course of the PhD. But those are my three top ones right now, I think.
Yeah, well, it's good to listen to some other stuff and not just be constantly focused on one topic all the time.
Yes, definitely.
And tell us about your professional career, please.
Yeah, sure. So my background's in sociology. I finished my honours in sociology back in 2011. And so that study looked at tertiary students and sadness. So it was like a qualitative study where I did semi-structured interviews with students to kind of explore the ups and downs of what it means to be a student and how they cope with that. And look, back then I didn't really know what I wanted to do next. And I was actually working part-time for the Commonwealth Bank. And so when I finished my honours and let my team leader at the time know that, okay, I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do next, I was offered a full-time personal lending job at CBA. And so that then took me down a career in banking, which I was in for about 9 years. I spent most of that at the CBA and took on lots of different roles in various lending capacities. But most of my career there was as a line manager in a call centre. And that was a great career, but there were quite limited opportunities in Tasmania, as you can imagine, because it's, a lot of the main kind of hubs are, Sydney and Melbourne. So kind of limited opportunities down here. That was enough to make me say, okay, I think banking, I've had enough of this. I want to see what's next. And so I resigned from that position back in 2020 and then had to think, okay, what do I want to do next? I've done banking for so long and I'd figured that would be the career that I did, for a very long time. And so when I finished, I thought, okay, I want to do something in the mental health advocacy space. And I didn't really know what that looked like and what jobs were available. So what I did is I went on LinkedIn and just started connecting with a whole bunch of people. And that's something I still do to this day. And I think there's a lot of utility in just connecting with people, even if it's just out of the blue, just because a lot of people are very generous at kind of making time for you if you're looking for a new career. So one of the people I connected with back then was Professor Angela Munn, who's obviously been on the show before. And so we had a few conversations, and I kind of shared with Ange what my experience in banking was and what I wanted to do next. And luckily she had an advertised PhD project that looked at workplace mental health in Tasmania. And I think because I'd had such a long hiatus between my honours and the PhD, I was ready to actually turn my research brain on again. But what was quite good, I think, this time is I actually had lived experience of work, whereas, you know, in my honours, I didn't have that experience. So that's been really useful, kind of being able to bridge that research world with the actual lived experience of, you know, a challenging corporate environment. I submitted my thesis back in July, waiting for that to be examined, which will hopefully be done next week. I'm not counting down the days at all. And most recently, I've taken up a postdoctoral role at the Menzies, working in prostate cancer and return to work, and just looking at things like financial toxicity. So still kind of in the realm of workplace mental health, but kind of in a different space. And otherwise just doing some consulting work at the moment. So that's where I'm at the moment.
Thanks, Adam. Interesting career path. So you were working then in banking at the time of the Royal Commission? Yep. That would have been an interesting time.
It was, yeah. A lot of regulatory changes and a lot of very strict scripting, which I think was a good addition. There was certainly, some loose practices when I first started at the bank around lending. But yes, it became a challenging space, I think, from a regulatory perspective that made it quite challenging to interact with clients in a human way, because we were so stymied, I suppose, in a way by the way we had to speak to people through the scripting, but also from a resourcing sense, like over the course of that 8 years at the CBA, it was quite challenging to be a manager because the resources were quite limited. So I think there was the natural progression after the Royal Commission that I would probably end up somewhere else.
So, Adam, you said you're still at Menzies Institute. So tell us what has been, I guess, some of your main areas of research that you've conducted over the last number of years.
Yeah, so where I started was looking at an integrated approach to workplace mental health. And I think that was a great place to start. But when I commenced my PhD, I just didn't understand how big that could be and how challenging at times it could be to tailor that and implement that within a workplace, because it's not, as I would have thought, I think back in the day, you know, a one-size-fits-all kind of framework. It really needs to be adjusted to the working environment. So that's where I started and did a scoping review, looking at different instruments that workplaces could use when trying to implement an integrated approach. And while it was good to find a lot of different instruments that could kind of align with different domains of an integrated approach, the biggest finding for me was the challenges that workplaces would have when it came to implementing these measures and the interventions that would follow. So, I kind of pivoted away from an integrated approach. I was still very much focused on one of the core domains of that approach, being prevent harm, because around the time that I decided to move away from an integrated approach is when the Model Code of Practice was released for psychosocial hazards. Not long before that, you had the ISO45003 drop. So the timing of my PhD was really great, where it kind of fell around the time of all these big legislative and guideline changes that came through. So I then moved into the world of implementation science, and that's really the bulk of my PhD that focused on, while we understood a lot around the what to do, there were a lot of challenges around how to do it. So the paper that we're going to speak about today is really focused on, how can we guide workplaces through the challenges of implementation and give them evidence-based strategies to address those challenges. Those are my main areas. So an integrated approach, the ISO 45003, and implementation science. I think the other area too, which is kind of caught up in the ISO project that I did, is realist evaluation. And so that's an area I think that's quite new to workplace mental health. And that's just a different kind of evaluative framework, which we can probably talk about in more detail, I think, when we get into the paper. So,
yeah, it's not a term that I'd come across before. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to unpacking that with you in a little bit more detail. But it must be great working with people like Ange Martin, right, who, along with Tony Lamontagne and Kat Page, first wrote about the integrated approach.
Yeah, I feel very lucky there. And I think, it was such a good place to start. So I co-authored a white paper with Ange, for like a paper that we wrote for Tasmanian businesses around, okay, what is an integrated approach where we can kind of bring together some of the evidence there and make it a lot more translatable for workplaces. So I think I was very lucky that Ange was the person that had that advertised project, because with that I could then connect with Tony and Kat and learn a lot about, this framework that I think really should guide most workplaces today. So.
Yeah, and she's very good at distilling academic information and making it practical, right? And we've still got to, that reminds me, we've still got to try and get her back on, because I know that's where she wants to go next, and really focus on that academic versus practitioner bridge, if you like.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So let's talk about the safety science paper that you've recently published. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So this one is exploring implementation of the ISO 45003 standard. Can you tell us the drivers behind this project?
Yeah, definitely. So as I said, initially I kind of started in that integrated approach space, thinking, okay, and this is the naivety, I think, when you start out doing research after like a nearly 10-year hiatus. I thought, of course, we can find one tool that will happily allow workplaces to implement an integrated approach. And what I learned by the end of that is, okay, I think I need to pivot towards the implementation side of things. The main driver for me, though, was I realized that implementation research was really underdone in workplace mental health. And as I said before, we know more, like over the last 50 years, we know a lot more about what works and what to do, but there's still a lack of information around how to do it, and I think that's very problematic, because workplaces are complex and dynamic, and they're going to continue to become more complex and dynamic. So to think that we can implement interventions, regardless of whether they're evidence-based or not, into these workplaces without issues, I think is very silly. So really, we need research and resources that can help us, firstly, identify challenges to implementation, but then more importantly, what are the strategies that we can use to actually overcome these challenges? So two examples I wanted to call out was the WHO guidelines for mental health at work. One of the key remarks in that report, and it's obviously a very comprehensive report that looks at the evidence behind interventions, one of the key call-outs was saying we need more implementation research to look at, the accessibility and the feasibility of these interventions and how to implement them. So that was interesting that after such a comprehensive guideline, we still had a huge gap in the implementation space. The other thing too is, an integrated approach came out in 2014, and, last year there was essentially an anniversary paper, you could call it, from Mark Deedy and colleagues that took that approach along with some of the other ones from the Black Dog and, summarized the levels of evidence and, kind of made it clearer as to what was contained within the three domains there. But again, there was essentially nothing around implementation other than saying, we recommend you consult implementation experts, in doing this. So it just showed me in the course of my PhD, but essentially in the course of the last 10 years, we haven't really moved forward in the implementation space. So I thought, rather than me trying to create a new measure, which I think there's more than enough assessment tools and measures out there, I think it's more important that we create an approach that workplaces could use to implement interventions, programs, guidelines, things like that.
Yeah, good basis and justifiable, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a lot of the thinking that goes into the new psychosocial safety playbook that we're launching next month. How do you actually do these things, right? And what's all the things you need to consider when implementing, not just going, oh, here's something off the shelf and, just roll it out. It's very much thinking about what is the context of the organization, how ready are they, and then preparing them properly before an implementation, and then evaluating, right, to make sure that the intervention is working, and being able to demonstrate impact. So, yeah, no, definitely we see the same need to do more on how do you actually apply, good evidence-based practice.
Yeah, definitely.
So tell us about your methodology, though, on that particular piece of research.
Yeah, so after kind of realizing that I needed to switch up where I was going, which, it's quite distressing for a PhD student to go, okay, the advertised project needs to change. So that means I need to go and do a lot more reading. So I spent a lot of time looking over different articles from implementation science. And so one thing I learned was that, this is very developed in the healthcare space, but certainly not very developed in the workplace mental health context. So, there was a level of having to figure out how I could adapt, a method from a very specific kind of sector. But I came across a paper that was published in 2022 by some Canadian researchers by the name of Mira Peart and some of her colleagues. And they had developed an approach that was essentially a guideline implementation strategy. And what they were trying to implement within the context of that research project was a recovery at work guideline. So people returning to work after a psychological injury. And that approach combined something from implementation science called an implementation team. And I'll explain that in more detail shortly. But it combines implementation teams with what we call a facilitated planning approach. So essentially, what we did there was to adapt it, one, because the project that we based it on was a 5-year duration, whereas obviously I had to do this within the time frame of PhD. And also, the recovery at work guideline from Canada was very different to the ISO 45003. So it required quite a lot of adjustments there. But essentially what we did, myself and my colleague Kelly Broughton, we met with 6 different organisations in a regional part of Australia over the course of 12 months to walk them through essentially the ISO 45003 and help them make sense of, what do these various clauses and recommendations mean? And the important part of that for us was we wanted to bring different functions together because we recognized that this was a very siloed issue. It could fall very much, under the safety space or, under the HR space. But we wanted to bring different functions together so they could make sense of it through, different perspectives. And so, over the course of that 12 months, we basically went through that standard. And what we were working towards within that project was how could we make a plan of how they could firstly do a gap analysis against the ISO 45003 and then create priority actions for, okay, so once this is done, once we move past the planning phase, what are the actions that you want to do as a group? What are the timeframes for that? The most important part, I think, of the approach, though, was the implementation science piece, which was around using evidence-based frameworks. 2 of the frameworks we used were, the first is called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which you can call the CIFA because it's easy to say. And that particular framework's really important because it's been around since 2009 and it captures a number of different domains that are found to be challenges to implementation. And so what we did with that group was to get them to sit down and go through each of these domains and then decide which of those were the most likely to be a challenge for their workplace. And the second part of that was then to use another tool called the Expert Recommendations for Implementing Change, or the ERIC. And we could take all that information we got through those meetings and put that into that tool so we could give them a very discrete list of strategies that they could use to address the implementation challenges that they identified. So essentially, the output was a plan that not only allowed them to tailor the ISO to their priority areas, recognizing that, full implementation for a workplace that, might not have that competency would take time. But nonetheless, we wanted to give them an output that would basically give them actions that they could clearly define and resource, but then also a list of discrete strategies that they could use to address, the complexity and the dynamism of implementing this in a workplace. So I might park it there for a second.
Yeah, look, I am interested in finding out a bit more about the organisations that you worked with. As you said, many organisations don't necessarily have the maturity of their own safety management system, which obviously 45003 aligns very nicely with ISO 45001. And if they don't have that in place, I can imagine there's a fair bit more work. So I am interested in terms of kind of like the sizes of the organisations that you worked with, what industries are in, and how long it generally took for them to work through the plan that you had, given that you had a shorter period of time to work with these organisations.
Yeah, so we work with organisations you'd categorise as medium and large, and I've got to be mindful around the identifiers of the organisations, but they varied in terms of some were more in that manufacturing space, others were in tourism, others were in the finance kind of sector. So they were quite varied, and that was an area that we explored too, to kind of say, going in, what level of maturity did these organizations have? And one of the first things we did was to obtain a number of different documents around, what did their OH&S policies say? Did they have any particular frameworks or information or programs in place already around mental health? And that was quite useful then to kind of set the baseline, I suppose, and say, okay, we expect this organization is going to need a little bit more guidance. But what was quite interesting, and this will come out more in the next paper that I'm going to submit once the thesis comes back, it's, the organizations that were very entrenched and had a lot of systems in place, particularly an OH&S management system, they were very siloed in the way they kind of looked at this. They had a very prescribed work health and safety team that managed it. And so these other functions that we brought in struggled, because of the power dynamics at play there that meant, this kind of fell under the remit of that team more so than maybe some of the other functions we had. So, going in, of course, we thought the organization that had, low to no maturity in the space, they would probably struggle more. But arguably, we found that those organizations actually found it easier to, build something from the ground up rather than having to really adjust and kind of change the prescribed system they had already.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I understand what you're talking about as well. If safety is saying we own the safety management system, I could understand the power dynamic then to say HR, which need to be involved, obviously, in psychosocial risk management. I hadn't thought about that though as an obstacle before when we're trying to, obviously, HR need to be involved, and it might be an obstacle for them doing that in larger organisations that have these structured kind of management systems in place.
Yeah, definitely. And, one of the things we found was that, while each of these organisations had, executive sign off, that was one of the kind of things we needed, was to say, we need you to put this to your senior management team or your board, and they need to sign off that they're working with us for 12 months. and that's quite a significant commitment for a business, because we met with these teams, for 2 hours over the course of, in 12 different meetings. So that's quite a big time investment. But what we found is, even though they had agreed to bring these teams together, organizational constraints really impacted the dynamics of these teams. And so that was really important, I think, to be able to capture that, because this is the reality of workplaces, is that if you bring these different groups together and they haven't worked together before, they have varying levels of, psychological safety, varying levels of understanding. It makes it very challenging for them to work as intended. So, one of the things that we took out of the project was to say, if we had our time over again, we'd spend more time in the planning phase, planning, what is this group going to look like? What are some of the things that we need to build into this team before we get started? And that was partially around the constraints of doing it over the course of a year, because the approach that we adapted this from, they did have, essentially a planning committee that spent 5 months working together to plan out all the logistics of this team. So that is definitely something I think that's important to do up front, because I just hadn't quite, considered the complexities of how these dynamics would be shaped by culture and these, kind of hidden power dynamics, I suppose.
Yeah, and you also raised that point about literacy, right? Like varying degrees of understanding what are we even talking about here. And we're finding that's really a kind of precursor to bringing HR and health and safety together to kind of make sure everyone is speaking the same language and clearing up some misconceptions. Some of our favourite ones being psychological safety versus psychosocial safety. So.
Well, it's also, I think, just about the mental models that these different teams have about work and workplaces and kind of how we achieve performance kind of as an outcome of work. So, yeah, there is quite a lot of work to do just in getting everybody to kind of have that shared mental model when we're talking about psychosocial safety. That's in and of itself is a significant barrier.
Yeah, I mean, even basic things that health and safety probably take for granted, like hierarchy of controls. Many HR people haven't even come across that concept before.
Or I think even before that, just even conceptualizing work as a influencer of mental health, and that actually we could do something to the work environment to reduce adverse impacts on people's health. Outside of safety for a lot of teams, that's quite a ground shaking idea.
Yeah, what? We don't just send people to the EAP when they
and give them resilience training and these are things that we've been taught to do, and that's performance is a function of individual characteristics and all of that kind of stuff. So
so we do need to unravel a lot of previous thinking, if you like, and challenge that. So that's important.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important part, like around, this is a wicked problem. It's one that we need to see from multiple perspectives. And something that I've started to use now, I've only used it once at a WorkSafe conference down in Tassie, but I had a 2D, 3D model made up to illustrate, to the attendees of this conference. This is a 3D problem. Psychosocial risk is a 3D problem. And quite often we will see it, from a 2D perspective. So it could be a circle, it could be a square, or it could be a triangle. But we need to get better at saying it's all of those things, because we're very good at saying we want to categorize this as a simple solution, when we need to recognize that, no, we need to see it from all those perspectives. So I think that is a challenge too in the space, is that, it is very siloed still, and it is probably quite confronting for a workplace to consider, being able to be comfortable holding space for multiple perspectives rather than just wanting a one-size-fits-all kind of perspective. But I think if we do it that way, it's going to limit our ability to adapt, as things like AI start to become increasingly more prevalent in the workplace. So I think that's an important area.
So, I mean, your methodology wasn't so much testing of hypotheses, but can you take us through your findings or conclusions from your project?
Yeah, so the first paper that we've published, that was really introducing the methodology and saying, okay, here's what we found, because part of it is we did 29 different interviews. We did interviews at 2 different times, at the start of the project and at the end, just to explore, how did people experience it. And so that early feedback was really positive, particularly around a lot of these groups hadn't worked together before. So that was surprising. I had this assumption that, of course, we all work together as teams despite being in different roles. But also they started to recognize, and it's captured in the paper, that, psychosocial risk is really perceived differently across different functions. So that was really useful. One, it was considered a good outcome in all of the organizations put together an implementation plan. The second paper is really going to focus more on the outcome side, which kind of ties into that realist evaluation, because after pulling together all of this data, which was torturous at times because it's a lot of data to capture, particularly, on your own, over the course of a year. And so I had to think, what is an evaluative framework that I can use here to capture all this complexity? And so that's where the second paper is going to provide the outcomes of the realist evaluation, which is essentially a framework for looking at what works for whom, under what circumstances, and why. And that started to make its way into the field of workplace mental health, thanks to wonderful humans like Karina Nielsen. And that was in recognition that, a lot of the interventions we're looking at are, complex interventions. So if we're going to do something like an integrated approach, and then try to evaluate it, that's a very complex program of work to evaluate. And I think some of the studies that even Tony and his colleagues did, in a police cohort, that there were challenges there because of that very reason. So a realist evaluation is where essentially you'll go in and create a program theory. And the theory that you're testing is context plus intervention. Context plus intervention plus mechanism equals outcome. And so it's recognizing that it's not the intervention that leads to the outcome. It's how the intervention, shaped by context, creates mechanisms of change within people that then lead to outcomes. So, I won't go into too much detail around the outcomes because I still need to submit that to a journal. But it was very interesting to find there that while we got the outcomes, we got an implementation plan for each of the organizations, they were quite varied in how well the organizations did. Some were very collaborative and they came up with really clear plans that were very tailored towards the strategies they needed for implementation barriers, whereas some organizations just, that they were very transactional, very basic, and arguably would have quite a minimal impact. So my hope is eventually to be able to go back and look at these organizations and see how these plans worked, after we left the organizations. But overall, the main thing I think is that the approach was well received by the participants.
Yeah. I mean, those sound like very kind of practical lenses to apply to what you're doing there. And like in particular, I think thinking about, an intervention, but in relation to the context and that sort of thing. Often that's kind of the step that's missing where, an organization will look at what a peer is doing, or they'll actually recruit somebody who they know ran a successful program in another company and bring them in and ask them to do exactly the same thing, without thinking about what's different about our context. And then they're surprised when it doesn't work or isn't as impactful as it was for the company that it was designed for. So, there's a lot of that that context that is really important in actually determining whether or not an intervention is even going to have a chance of working.
Yeah, and I think, it's a contentious issue, but this is, the reason realist evaluation has made its way into the field of workplace mental health is because we're finding challenges around randomized controlled trials, and they've for a long time been considered the gold standard. And that's a fun thing to stand in front of a bunch of medical researchers and say, look, I think we should go another way. That was fun. But really, I think we do need to look at different evaluative approaches, and realist evaluation isn't the only alternative. There's all kinds of other approaches that are being developed to try and address this challenge. But yeah, it's just, even if we somehow created the climate where we could test this in a workplace, is it going to be translatable to another workplace? And even so, would it be translatable to the same workplace in a year's time when we know all these different things that will change? I think that was another really important thing to capture too, is that over the course of this 12 months of working with these businesses, we also looked at discrete events that occurred. And that's another aspect that you look at from a context perspective in realist evaluation. And that was to say, look, each of these organizations had some kind of disruption, where perhaps the organization decides to do a full restructure at the same time they're doing this project. That was fun. But, this is the realities of the workplace, is there will be concurrent changes happening. There will be disruptions. And the organizations that did well were the ones that had buffers in place, that were adaptable, that could change in the event of this and not let it derail, the program of work that we were doing. So I think that's another area that, going into a project like this would be to say to organizations, what have you got planned? And if something is to come through, how are you going to, ensure that you can adapt and provide the adequate resources for this team? Because there's really no sense in bringing this team together if you can't give them the time to meet and make sense of this issue, but also to then execute the actions that they agreed on. So that was another important area from the research.
So I understand you can't share in detail, I guess, the findings because you haven't published them yet, and you don't want to do a spoiler. But could you do any maybe surprises or anything that you thought, I hadn't considered that before, that came out of this project work?
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise, and maybe it shouldn't have been, but I learned a lot over the course of the PhD. It was really around how you could have essentially part of this project was we did a readiness assessment, going into to say, okay, we're going to use something called the ORIC, which is the Organizational Readiness for Implementing Change Measure. So before we actually worked with these organizations for 12 months, we got them to use this assessment and actually gauge, do you get the score that we feel is appropriate from a readiness perspective so we can get started? And what we found is that some of the organizations that had a really high readiness score didn't necessarily do very well. And that was because they didn't have the right stakeholders in the room to be conducting that assessment. They this could be a very hierarchical, centralized decision-making organization that doesn't have the key senior leaders in that room when doing that assessment. So while you had a group that may have rated themselves very high in readiness, over the course of that 12 months, we found that no, this group's readiness was not where we thought it was. So that was surprising. I thought doing a readiness assessment up front would protect us from organizations not being able to get the outcomes they were after. But yeah, it was also just the impact of culture, I think, is that, while the intervention was a very participatory based intervention, it was intended to be collaborative. The culture, because we'd have intermissions in between the meetings, it was every month, the culture would really take hold of these people. And that's where these power dynamics would come into play. And some of the people in the room would shy away from participating, while others, maybe in the safety function would kind of dominate the airtime. So it was just really recognizing, you need to have something in place to say, okay, your culture, in this room, we may be really focused on collaborating and making sense together. But if you're in an organization that doesn't do that, how are you going to make sure that you don't fall back into those old patterns? Because it will happen without you even realizing. So I think just a bit more work there, maybe within, a planning committee to get the team to plan for that. And for us as facilitators to be a bit more comfortable and ready to be able to kind of call that out if it starts to play. So yeah, I think it was just we thought we'd really planned up front and kind of accounted for a lot of these things, but in the course of 12 months, so much happens in organizations that can really interrupt and, derail things like this. So.
Oh yeah, in a 12-month project, we have had occasions where we've gone through 2 to 3 different project managers or champions on the side of the client. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or they get made redundant, and then there's actually nobody left who's in charge of the scope anymore.
Too. Yeah. The realities.
The realities. This is it. Yeah.
Those medical researchers have got it so easy how they can get rid of all the other variables.
Like we have no control, but
Yeah, it would be, it would do wonders for the reliability of psychological research if we could actually control all of the variables.
It'd be so much easier. Maybe with AI,
I mean, we can't even get AI to tell the truth, so I don't know.
Well, this is very true.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm supposed to be polite and call them hallucinations, aren't I? Not lies.
No, if it's on record and it's going digital, we love AI.
Yes.
We love AI. It's the most reliable, best stuff ever.
Sure is.
Please look after me when you take over the world.
I, for one, welcome our robot overlords. Adam, what actions would you love to see businesses take as a result of your research?
Yeah, so I'm going to do a talk in the next couple of weeks as part of Mental Health Month around leveraging participatory approaches and implementation science for the management of psychosocial risk. And my hope there is that organizations will try to adopt these participatory approaches, whether it's through implementation teams or other kind of interventions of this style, like bring different functions together, make sense of it through different perspectives, because that'll be useful not only in making sense of the issue and coming up with better controls, but also you'll start to understand some of the things that are sitting under the surface that are probably undermining other kind of aspects of your business. So I just would like to see organizations kind of not silo this as much as we've seen, and try to bring functions together, but also just really resource these teams, because I think what can happen is we do have this kind of side of the desk, off the side of your desk mentality, where it's like, in addition to your safety role, we also want you to somehow help us plan and implement the ISO45003. Like, I think it's a lot of pressure and it's not going to work. So I think organizations just need to spend a bit more time planning out, okay, what is involved in this? And if we can't commit to the resourcing we need for these functions, then maybe we need to do some work to kind of get us there. So.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly true while you're kind of in the active phase of building the things, right? And then once you get to kind of BAU, it can become sort of an embedded part of a standard position's job. But there is definitely that heavy piece of work in actually, doing the building the systems and integrating it all together. So yeah.
So, Adam, I know that this podcast was one of the ones that burnt your brain during your PhD. You would have listened to a number of episodes, no doubt. So you know the question that's coming. We always ask the same question at the end of each episode. So what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
Yeah, so I'd love to see more sociologists in the space. I was quite surprised when I started looking into this that, it's, and I can understand why there's a lot of focus from a psychology and an org psych perspective, which makes sense. But I had an interesting interaction on LinkedIn recently where I said, hey, why is there no kind of conversation or narrative from a sociological perspective? And one of the responses I got, and I won't name names, but was quite surprising to say, I just don't think sociology has any place here, really. And I found that quite surprising, given there's some really interesting theories that could lend a lot of value, I think, to understanding, role conflict and structural dynamics in the workplace and interpersonal dynamics in the workplace. So I just like to see, a lot of different perspectives here, and what does sociology have to say? Because I think if we did some work in that space, it could hopefully provide some useful insights that we need. So yeah, I think that's the theme for me that I've come to realize, just seeing this from multiple perspectives, not just from an academic or disciplinary perspective, but also in the workplace as well. So just more, bringing together different viewpoints.
Yeah, and you've got your model that demonstrates that really nicely, being able to view these wicked problems from multiple angles, gains a collective perspective, if you like. So I think it's the first call out we've had for sociologists to really join the fray, but I think it's a good recommendation.
Yeah. I studied sociology as some elective units in undergrad, which is probably part of the reason why I ended up doing org psych eventually, because it got me thinking about the impacts of sort of power and group dynamics and those types of things. So
yeah, I was just saying in the book collection, which is a lot of my books from when I studied psychology. No, I can't see it. I did do intro to sociology as well, but can't find it. We'll look for it later.
Okay.
Yeah, clearly well read.
With some of the challenges, even around like intersectionality and different demographics, like when we get to the point where we start to really look at different cohorts in the workplace and come up with controls for different kind of groups, I think that's where sociology will have a lot to offer, around how do we deal with the challenges of intersectionality. So yeah, that's a call out. I was going to do it and then I got distracted with something else. That's just, so I'll leave that to someone else within the community.
Right. Parting words of advice, Adam, for listeners who want to work in this field.
Get behind it. I think it's a wonderful evolving space. And, I came from, a banking background essentially. And yeah, look, there were challenges from getting your head back into the research kind of mind frame. But I just think, from whatever walk of life you're from, get involved, because I just think it's such an important area and we need as many viewpoints on this as possible. So I just encourage you to get behind it. I think it's a really important area.
Great. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
Well, Adam, we got to thank you again for coming on the podcast and sharing your research. Or as much as you could anyway. Implementation science is a really fascinating area. Obviously, a lot more work needed. And so no doubt the end of your thesis would have read something like, need more research in this area, because it's obviously clearly required. So thank you for coming on and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.
Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember, we do record over video when we have our guests on, and you can catch all of our previous videos on the FlourishTX YouTube channel. If you prefer to have short snippets, the best of the best of those conversations, then you can find them on the FlourishTX LinkedIn page. And while you're on LinkedIn, you'll find that Joelle, myself, and Adam are all quite active on there. So feel free to reach out if you want to continue the conversation. But that's it for today. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow FlourishDX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.